Secretary of State Antony Blinken moved one step closer to embracing Ukraine's bid to join NATO. Let's listen to what he had to say.
Ukraine, the determination of every country represented here at NATO remains rock solid. We will do everything that we can, allies will do everything that they can to ensure that Ukraine has what it needs to continue to deal with Russia's ongoing aggression against Ukraine, an aggression that gets worse with every passing day. Ukraine will become a member of NATO. Our purpose at the summit is to help build a bridge to that membership and to create a clear pathway for Ukraine moving forward.
There was strong reaction from several members of Congress, including Senator J.D. Vance, who posted this on Twitter. "This is completely irresponsible. Ukraine should not join NATO, and to invite them during a war is to invite our nation into war." The tweet continued, "Do you want American ground troops in Ukraine? If not, we must push back against the idea that Ukraine should join NATO." Now, I don't believe just that NATO or that Ukraine would be able to join right now because they're in an active conflict, but there's something pretty irresponsible about making this declarative statement when previously the various members of NATO have been kind of split as to whether or not Ukraine should join at all. And this is only going to serve to further antagonize Russia, which uses Ukraine's potential joining of NATO as one of its excuses for launching this offensive in the first place.
Yeah, I don't want to assume that Antony Blinken didn't mean to say that, but it did seem to be a statement that was made kind of carelessly. That's a huge statement to make, that Ukraine will be a part of NATO, especially considering there are many Ukrainians who don't want to be a part of NATO. They felt that the time for Ukraine to join NATO was long before Russia invaded Ukraine, and they felt left behind by NATO and a lot of Western countries. A lot of them felt a sense of national pride when formerly the culture in Ukraine was very much to slowly become more like other European countries. But then defending themselves against Russia without the help of NATO led them to say, you know what, forget NATO. We are Ukrainians. We have our own culture. And there was this kind of nationalism that didn't exist before the invasion. And today, I'm not sure many Ukrainians, or at least the same amount of Ukrainians, would like to be a member nation of NATO. Also, the alliance is founded upon this idea of collective defense, that if an ally nation is attacked, then all nations act as if they are attacked. I think, perhaps Antony Blinken was hinting that, eventually Ukraine will be a part of NATO, but it will be after the conflict. But can we really anticipate long-term peace between Russia and Ukraine? I don't see there being many benefits to Ukraine being a member nation of NATO now. We already have the consideration of long-term funding of Ukraine to the tune of $107 billion, 100 billion euros as a long-term fund. I mean, what more would Ukraine need that NATO's not already doing, with Ukraine not a member nation of NATO?
That's right. And that's why Senator Vance's tweet, I think, is very relevant, because even if it's not the case that Ukraine is going to join tomorrow and we have to immediately send U.S. troops over to help defend them, it's likely the case that if they join, there's going to be another conflict pretty shortly down the line with further aggression from Russia. And the United States will then have an obligation to get involved in that. And there's simply not an appetite for that among the American people. They don't feel that Ukraine is as enough of a strategic interest for the United States for their kids to go and spill blood for that country. And you brought up the Ukraine funding, which has been sort of languishing in Congress over the past couple of months, much to the chagrin of the Biden administration and some of the members of the establishment on both the Democrat and Republican parties, thanks in part to Speaker Johnson, who has refused to bring that up for a vote. But he's now suggesting that we either give Ukraine a loan or we take seized Russian assets from sanctions and use that to fund the war effort. And I think that sort of misses the point, because Bree brought up, earlier this week, and what I thought was an important point, which is that the longer you continue to fund Ukraine with American dollars and weaponry, you're only prolonging a conflict that inevitably is going to end in some kind of negotiation and costing more lives in the process. So there's not just a fiscal responsibility component to deciding to give Ukraine billions and billions of more dollars, but there's also the component of whether or not it's even wise to do so if what you really want is an expeditious and fair conclusion to the conflict without continuing to have so many Ukrainians killed that they basically have elderly people joining the military in the hopes of trying to defend their land. So again, it's not just fiscal responsibility. It's not just concerns about how we could better spend that money at home. Both of those are completely valid and definitely part of the conversation. But the other element that just giving a loan to Ukraine doesn't address is this idea of how are we going to use our own policymaking and our own decisions about funding Ukraine to perhaps affect the trajectory of this war that, again, is inevitably going to end in both sides having to concede something.
Right. The assumption that perhaps Ukraine joining NATO will reverse the situation for Ukraine and Russia is probably misled. This idea that NATO has an open door policy, if you will, that if a nation meets the standards of joining NATO, they are free to join. But also, the original treaty does say that it has to be in the interest of North Atlantic security. And there are some questions about, security being in question if Ukraine joins NATO. Will this prolong the war in Ukraine and further jeopardize neighboring European countries? That's really what's at stake. It seems to me that, as Stephen Walt for the Quincy Institute has argued as well, that it would actually be worse for Ukraine to join NATO at this point in time. And there is a world where it's okay, let's collectively send some funding to Ukraine because it is in Western interest to not have Russia at our doorstep. But simultaneously, Ukraine doesn't need to be or should not be, for security reasons, a member of NATO. So it does seem reckless for Blinken to say this. It does seem to be more of the old same policies of, oh my God, Russia bad, we're going to be very reactionary about this. I think it's really time to be a realist when it comes to foreign policy, and for the United States to change their tune and not act as if they have unquestionable power. We have the largest military in the world, but I think, it is a powerful thing to do to consider long-term peace over short-term goals that may not be promised even if Ukraine joins NATO.
Yeah, and I still have not heard from a single person asking for this additional $10-20 billion, or I guess now we've already given $100 billion plus to Ukraine. Not a single one of them has indicated what dollar amount do we have to give in order for Ukraine to have a chance at winning this war. And I mean, the obvious answer, based on all of the people that we've interviewed on this show about this conflict, there's simply not a reasonable or realistic path to victory for Ukraine at this point. And so again, we're just prolonging the conflict. I think there definitely need to be more questions asked to the White House and the State Department about what Blinken said, because this is a departure from what they've said and what the president has said previously. President Joe Biden said in an interview previously, when asked about Ukraine joining NATO, that they weren't ready yet, that they had these steps that they had to take to basically qualify and to get the NATO coalition to accept them as a member. And so I want to know what's changed between then and now, such that Blinken is now saying, no, they're going to be a member. Basically, it's a question of when, not if. Again, what changed on Ukraine's side, or what changed in the American posture such that we're now saying, oh, no, they're going to be in, as opposed to they've got a ways to go?
Right. Yeah. Last spring, they were very optimistic about the counteroffensive, and they turned out to be wrong. So if this is a situation, again, where they're optimistic about the counteroffensive and they end up being wrong, and this makes matters worse, it's going to put the United States and Ukraine in a worse position. We're going to continue to follow this. More Rising after this.